Walk into any museum of medieval arms today and you'll find swords, hundreds of them. Iron blades, bronze blades, ceremonial blades, war blades, each one tagged, catalogued, dated, explained. None of them is Excalibur, and yet Excalibur may be the most famous weapon in human history. More recognizable than any gun, any spear, any blade ever forged. A sword pulled from a stone by a boy who would become a king. A sword returned to a lake by a dying man. A sword that, depending on who you ask, either never existed at all or is waiting somewhere to be found again. So which is it? That question has obsessed historians, archaeologists, and storytellers for over 1,000 years. And the answer, when you dig past the legend into the actual historical record, is far stranger and more fascinating than most people expect. Let's start with what we actually know. The earliest written references to Arthur don't mention Excalibur at all. The first significant source is a Welsh text called the Historia Britannum, written around 830 AD, roughly 4 centuries after Arthur supposedly lived. It describes a military leader named Arthur fighting 12 battles against the Saxons. No sword, no stone, no magic. A century later, the Annales Cambriae, the Welsh Annals, references a battle of Badon and a battle of Camlan, where Arthur falls. Still no sword, still no stone. The sword appears later, much later. In 1136, a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth publishes his Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain. It's here that Arthur transforms from a military commander into something approaching legend. Geoffrey gives him a sword. He calls it Caliburnus. Forged, he says, on the Isle of Avalon. Geoffrey doesn't describe a stone. He doesn't describe a lake. He just gives Arthur a remarkable blade with an almost mythological origin. Caliburnus. Say it slowly. Listen to how it shifts. Caliburnus becomes Caliburn. Caliburn becomes Excalibur. The name itself is a journey through languages. Latin, Welsh, Old French. Each culture that picks up the story, filing off the edges and reshaping it to fit their own imagination. But where did Geoffrey get it from? This is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Geoffrey was not making things up from nothing. He was working with existing Welsh traditions, oral histories, and earlier texts that no longer survive. The Welsh had stories of powerful named swords long before Geoffrey wrote anything down. One of the earliest is called Calid Fuilch, a sword belonging to a hero named Culhwch in a collection of Welsh myths called the Mabinogion. Calid Fuilch is described as one of the 13 treasures of Britain, a blade of extraordinary power. Calid Fuilch, Caliburnus. The linguistic connection is not subtle, but Calid Fuilch itself may have older roots. Some scholars have traced the name back to an Irish sword called Caladbolg, a mythological blade belonging to several Irish heroes, described as capable of cutting through anything, sometimes described as flashing with a light like lightning. Caladbolg appears in the Ulster Cycle, one of the oldest bodies of Irish mythology, predating Geoffrey of Monmouth by centuries. So the chain looks something like this: an Irish mythological sword, an early Welsh retelling, a 12th century Latin history. And then, a century after Geoffrey, the French poets get hold of it. The French take Excalibur and build a cathedral around it. Chrétien de Troyes writes his Arthurian romances in the late 12th century. He introduces the Lady of the Lake, the Round Table as a moral institution, and the full chivalric world that most people today associate with Camelot. He doesn't describe the sword in the stone specifically, but he establishes the framework that later writers fill in. The sword in the stone appears fully formed in the Prose Merlin, a French text from around 1220. Here is the famous scene: the sword embedded in an anvil on a stone in a churchyard, the inscription promising kingship to whoever can draw it. The knights failing, the boy Arthur succeeding without effort. And separately, in another tradition, a different sword, the sword from the lake, given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake when Caliburn is broken. 2 swords, 2 stories, different origins that later writers collapsed into one. In some versions they are explicitly distinguished, in others they are treated as the same blade. Thomas Malory, writing his Morte d'Arthur in 1469, is largely responsible for the version most people know today. He tries to reconcile the 2 traditions awkwardly. Arthur pulls a sword from a stone to prove his kingship. That sword later breaks. Merlin takes him to a lake where a hand rises from the water holding a new sword. That is Excalibur. The scabbard, Merlin warns, is more valuable than the sword itself. While Arthur wears the scabbard, he cannot bleed from any wound. This is the version that embedded itself into Western culture: a magical sword, a magical scabbard, a lake, a hand, a dying king returning the blade to the water. But beneath all of this layered mythology, is there anything real? Possibly. There are genuine 5th and 6th century swords that survive from Britain. Roman-style spatha blades used by Romano-British warriors during exactly the period when Arthur supposedly lived. They were status objects. Some were ceremonially important. Some were given names by their owners. The idea of a named, significant sword is not fantastical at all. It's historically documented across multiple cultures. Viking swords were named. Norse sagas are full of famous named blades. Charlemagne carried a sword called Joyeuse. Roland carried Durendal. The naming of exceptional weapons was a real and widespread practice. It wasn't mythology. It was how important objects were recorded and remembered in predominantly oral cultures. If there was a real Arthur, and the debate continues, genuinely, among serious historians, then it's entirely plausible that he carried a sword that was notable enough to be remembered, a Roman-era blade perhaps, inherited from an earlier generation, which would have seemed extraordinary to post-Roman Britons who no longer had access to that level of metalwork, something that looked, to 5th century eyes, almost impossibly well made, almost magical. That sword, passed through oral tradition for centuries before anyone wrote it down, could have accumulated legend with every retelling. The stone could be a mistranslation. The Latin word for anvil is very close to the Latin word for stone in certain medieval manuscripts. The original inscription may have read from the anvil, not from the stone. A sword drawn from a blacksmith's anvil, a ceremonial presentation, a formal investiture, transformed through copying errors and oral drift into the iconic stone. Then there's the lake. Lake traditions around swords are not unique to Arthurian legend. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of deliberately deposited swords from lakes, rivers, and bogs across Europe. This was a real practice, a widespread, documented, ancient ritual of returning valuable objects, especially weapons, to bodies of water as offerings. The Thames has yielded hundreds of deliberately deposited Bronze Age and Iron Age weapons, Scandinavian lakes, Irish bogs, continental rivers. The hand rising from the lake to receive Excalibur is almost certainly a literary image built on top of a real cultural practice. Returning a sword to water was not strange, it was sacred. It was how certain cultures marked the death of important people. The weapon went back to the water so it wouldn't pass to an unworthy hand. A 6th century warrior king dying in battle, his followers returning his sword to a lake according to ancient custom. That image, preserved in memory and oral tradition for centuries, emerging in 12th century French poetry as a mysterious hand and a magical blade. It's not proof, but it is a plausible mechanism for how a real event could become an impossible legend. In 1191, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey announced they had found Arthur's grave. Conveniently, their abbey had recently burned down and they needed funds to rebuild. They dug in their cemetery and produced a lead cross inscribed with the words, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon." They also produced bones, large bones they claimed, of a man of extraordinary size. Most historians today regard this as a medieval fraud. The inscription's lettering style is inconsistent with 6th century practice. The timing, immediately after a financially devastating fire, is suspicious. The monks had every reason to manufacture a discovery that would draw pilgrims and donations, but it created something durable. The idea that Excalibur might still be somewhere, that Arthur might return. The legend of the once and future king, Rex quondam Rex qui futurus, the king who was and will be again. This idea, perhaps more than any other, is why Excalibur still matters. Because Excalibur was never really about a sword. Every culture that picks up the Arthurian legend reshapes it around its own anxieties. The medieval French made it about chivalry and courtly love. The Victorians made it about empire and noble sacrifice. The 20th century made it about democracy, the sword in the stone as a rejection of inherited power, the idea that leadership must be earned, not born into. The sword changes meaning with every generation that holds it. That might be the most honest answer to the question of whether Excalibur really existed. As a physical object, a specific blade that a specific man carried, probably not in the form the legend describes. The stone, the lake, the magical scabbard, those are the accumulated poetry of 1,000 years of storytelling. But as something real, a named, significant weapon carried by a real leader in a real struggle, remembered and transformed by the people who came after, possibly, even probably. The historical core of the Arthurian legend is not the magic, it's the man, a Romano-British leader in the chaos after Rome withdrew, someone who held something together when everything was falling apart, who was remembered, celebrated, and eventually mythologized by the people whose survival he may have helped secure. That man almost certainly carried a sword, whether that sword had a name, whether that name eventually became Excalibur, whether it ended its days at the bottom of a lake tended by the memory of grateful people, that we cannot know. What we know is that the legend never died, and legends that never die usually have a reason. As always, we'll see you in the park.